The following is a conversation between myself, Franc Milburn, and Colonel John Alexander, focusing primarily on the white papers written by Franc that have subsequently been published on the Begin-Sadat Center for Strategic Studies, a globally ranked independent non-partisan think tank conducting policy-relevant research on Middle Eastern and global strategic affairs, particularly as they relate to the national security and foreign policy of Israel and regional peace and stability. Franc Milburn is a strategic and operational advisor, a former UK military intelligence officer. He is an alumnus of Sandhurst and the London School of Economics, and has written for the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University, and the BESA Center. Franc has also recently become a member of the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. The SCU is a think tank of scientists, researchers, and professionals stretching across organizations, governments, and industries to scientifically and publicly explore anomalous phenomena known around the world as UFOs or UAP. Colonel John Alexander is a retired United States Army colonel, an infantry officer for much of his career. He is best known as a leading advocate for the development of non-lethal weapons and of military applications of the paranormal. In 1985, he established the Advanced Theoretical Physics Group, the members of which were derived from various areas of the United States Defense Intelligence Community, all of whom held top-secret Secure Compartmented Information or TS-SCI clearances. The objective of the group was to investigate the UFO issue. He is also the author of the book UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities, and the former director of the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, Luis Elizondo, dubbed Colonel Alexander as the godfather of everything weird and spooky at the Pentagon. You can find links in the description box below for both Colonel Alexander's book and Franc Milburn's papers that have been published on the BESA Center. And so without further delay, I hope you enjoy this conversation between myself, Franc Milburn, and Colonel John Alexander. It's an absolute pleasure to have you two gentlemen on to speak with me today. We're going to be primarily covering the two white papers that have been written by Franc and subsequently published on the Begin-Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. The first paper was covered quite extensively, actually, by myself, Franc Milburn, and Bob McGuire. And so for all of those listening, there will be a link in the description box below for that previous video. But this time, Franc and I are joined by another one of the contributors to his work and an absolute legend within the field of ufology, Colonel John Alexander. And before we jump into some of the specific contributions from yourself, John, could you just let me and the listeners know how you got connected to Franc Milburn and why you decided to contribute to his work?
Actually, he, I think, emailed me out of the blue. And followed up and then said he was doing the article. It seemed to be reasonably sane and straightforward. So we did it. That has been the case in the material that was published.
So you were first introduced within the papers after the email exchanges that were included between Dr. Eric Davis and a man named Sid. I think that's the only name included in the email exchange, but the exchanges between Eric and Sid are regarding the legitimacy of the Navy Tic Tac videos and whether the Tic Tac craft is an Earth-based technology or an extraterrestrial technology, to which Eric responds by saying that those craft are off-world, going on to say that he told two Senate committee staff members and Department of Defense agencies the same thing. What I want to do is I want to read a response to this within Franc's paper from yourself and then finish it off with a question, if that's okay with you.
Sure. Yeah, you do know that Eric and I used to work together.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. So your statement was that, in short, I agree with Eric. We worked together when he was with NIDS. I think I referred him to Bob Bigelow to get hired. As we discussed, the objects are not made by humans. That said, the ET hypothesis is too simple. Trying to raise the complexity issues with the general public is well beyond their comprehension. So simply stating not man-made should meet the needs of most people. So if at all possible, I would like to get a bit more of an in-depth response from yourself in regards to the extraterrestrial hypothesis being too simple of an explanation and that the general public would struggle to comprehend the reality of the situation if it were to be explained. Now, my audience is far more educated than the general public on these issues. And so I would really appreciate it if you were able to just unpack this statement in more detail. Are we dealing with an ultra-terrestrial, extra-dimensional component? What is it that you believe to be beyond the comprehension of the general public?
Well, maybe I should go to the last paragraph of my UFO book. That was UFOs, Myths, Conspiracies, and Realities. And basically it said that whatever this is, it is terribly complex and probably beyond our possibility to imagine. And we're not at the point of getting simple answers, but we're not even asking the right questions yet. That's usually followed by what are the right questions, and I really don't know. But what we're dealing with is terribly, terribly complex. The reason I come down against the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which is very popular and a logical starting point if you haven't become embroiled in this topic.
Right.
But let me just say, there have been reports of interactions between humans and sentient non-human beings throughout the entirety of human history, and it involves in all cultures. That they fly in on little tin cans is a fairly new wrinkle in that. They fairly did a few decades when we're looking at millennia of reports. Also, if you look at the reports of what these beings are like, it is so diverse that you would have to say Earth is on the bucket list, the galactic bucket list of places you must visit if all of these different kinds of beings are stopping by. And even worse, that they have subdivided Earth. Certain types go to certain areas and belong to them. I am convinced, let me be clear, I think the events do occur. So I'm not suggesting that these are illusions or hallucinations or anything else. At least some of them are actually physical interactions. But how that emerges, what you discussed about interdimensional or intertemporal or whatnot, I think it's beyond our ability to comprehend at this point.
Anything to add there, Frank? Do you agree with the concept of it being probably a bit too complex to just kind of pigeonhole it within the extraterrestrial hypothesis?
Yeah, when I first came to the subject, I was still very much thinking along, the extraterrestrial hypothesis, as a lot of people do. And when you speak to people who don't study the topic, they're very much, they immediately think of aliens, ET. But no, I think it's very, very much more complicated than that. And I think you would have to look at it very much on a case-by-case basis. But it seems to me there's infinite possibilities for the different scenarios that the colonel's outlined, or maybe even combinations thereof. We just don't know. And we have to try and figure it out on a case-by-case basis. Some might be, kind of pure ETH. Some might be, a sort of time travel angle, or maybe, there could be a combination thereof, and we just don't know. It's so complex.
If I might add to that, the question immediately comes up is there life someplace in the universe? Sentient beings? And I think the answer is yes. And it's not based on belief, that's based on mathematics. As we're finding more and more Earth-like or inhabitable planets, you get into literally astronomical numbers of possibilities. And so if you just looked at the math and the potential for certain chemicals and events happening along the way, the probability of life out there is almost certain.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it was relatively recently that new studies had shown that there were quite a alarming a number of habitable and even super habitable planets that were even more suitable than Earth. Well,
like I say, the numbers are, I forget what it was, the number plus 16 zeros.
Yeah.
Or the number of probably inhabitable planets available throughout the galaxies, plural.
Now, something else that, John, that you mentioned in this paper is that these phenomena have been interacting with us since recorded history began and have interacted with all cultures. Do you think that whatever these phenomenon are, or at least some element of it, that they have had a hand in our development from a theological, philosophical, perhaps even a biological or genomic perspective? Are we the product of an intelligent intervention of some sort?
Don't know, but that's certainly one reasonable hypothesis. That we are them, or that as somebody, if you look at speciation that has taken place, i.e., evolution has moved along. We think of it moving like this. Speciation is where you see, a quantum leap, and you go, well, how did that come about? We can't say that is true, and from a religious perspective, that often gets to be quite disconcerting. Or controversial at least, but it's certainly a workable hypothesis.
Just giving you a moment if you wanted to add anything, Frank. If not, I'll move on.
No, I mean, all I'd say to that is, I mean, you can see, for example, I don't know, with ancient astronaut theory, I mean, how popular that's become, people getting involved in the anthropological and also the archaeological aspects of that. I mean, there are some very, very interesting cases, like Puma Punku and places in the Middle East. But at the end, do we have hard data for it? Is the key question.
Well, biologically, also you see some big, fairly substantial leaps, and we call it missing links, if you will.
Right,
but
yeah.
There's probably more continuation. But the question there becomes, was there genetic manipulation? I mean, what we're beginning to understand in doing with DNA and RNA and the ability to manipulate that and the resultant offspring, we're not far, literally, from being able to clone or create human life. No, that's taking aside the, ethics and moral issues. I mean, but just from a pure technological standpoint, the potential is already there. And so if you take and you're suggesting a civilization, sentient phenomena of some kind that's as far in advance, you can see how it is at least, within the realm of possibility.
Absolutely. I would like to move into, because this was the next part that was covered in Frank's first paper with yourself, the Advanced Theoretical Physics Group. Now, John, you set this group up in 1985, and it was so named in order to essentially obfuscate its purpose and avoid Freedom of Information Act requests about the internal research topics of the group. The focal point of the ATP was the study of the UFO issue, and it was eventually described by the Washington Post as the voodoo warriors of the Pentagon.
That's quite different now.
Oh, okay, sorry.
No. What the voodoo warriors of the Pentagon actually refers to the remote viewing program.
Ah, okay.
And that was years before that happened. Well, I published the New Mental Battlefield, which was in Military Review, which was the first time, a regular military journal had published an article on phenomena. But I was talking there about psychokinesis and remote viewing and things like that. That was Jack Anderson's article that came out in the Washington Post, I think in probably 81, but that was not referring to the work because that we hadn't even evolved to that point yet.
Right. Okay. Sorry, my mistake. Luis Elizondo also dubbed you as the godfather of everything weird and spooky at the Pentagon. First of all, would you say that's an accurate title?
Well, I think that's a bit of an extrapolation.
Well, I would love to know if there was an initial catalyst behind the creation of the Advanced Theoretical Physics Group. How did your work eventually culminate in a need for the ATP to exist?
Well, I have always been interested, always. I can remember back to 1947 when the whole UFO thing was first coming out and having interest, 10 at the time. And what I remember is that I went to a very unusual grade school that had an internal broadcast system, and the kids used to periodically be able to give talks. And I gave a talk on UFOs at that point. So the interest in that and other phenomenology have been pretty constant. So then I got in a position. People used to ask, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm a freelance colonel." This was time when budgets were a bit better, and I was working for some people who had, Bert Subelbein in particular, who was, again, interested and caused some of these things to happen. But I just got in a position where I could, so we kind of said, what the hell? Now, our assumption, of course, was that there was a big black program going on someplace. But we also anticipated that either they wanted to get the information out, we're looking for a conduit to do that, and we could become that, or B, we would get severely beaten and told, sit down, shut up, go suck your thumb in the corner. And neither of which happened. And rather, as I just put it together, and as we said, we had people from all of the services, from the intelligence community and from aerospace. They all had to have the TS and what we call SCI level clearances and all that, and got together and compared. And amazingly, everybody else, they were all interested, thought along the same lines, we thought you were doing that. Well, no, isn't that your responsibility? And as I've said, over the years, it took quite a while, but I was going to higher and higher levels, and basically was getting a very consistent response from everybody. I would usually try to get them pregnant, meaning I would ask for something, not a big thing, but to get them actively involved. Nobody ever shut me down, and people just got passed on and on. One of the stories that I do tell in the book is that I was meeting with a retired lieutenant general who had been the head of one of those three-letter agencies that would have to be involved. If you listen to, how these things happen, we have these response teams waiting out to pounce on UFOs any place in the world and all of that. They would have been integrally involved. The information would have gone through that agency. And he goes, A, we don't do that. There's no requirement. But more importantly, B, I'll tell you about the ones I saw. So here you had an individual who was the head of one of those agencies who had had a personal experience, a sighting of things that happened years prior, but he knew aerodynamically it was impossible and far beyond the technological capabilities at that time. And yet that did not translate into institutional interest or responsibility. And I do make a big differentiation between individual interest and institutional responsibility or institutional interest. I think the individual interest has always been there because we know in the military, in the government, wherever, their level of experiences, people seeing these, certainly replicates, if not exceeds, that of the civilian sector, particularly in pilots, for instance, that have had more time to be exposed. So it's, it's like I say, it just kind of defied explanation, but that's sort of the evolution.
So when you actually set up the ATP and it was functioning, did you find that people were quite willing to tell you their own personal stories then in regards to members of the military and intelligence?
Well, there are interesting. There's a lot of parallels between what we did and the remote viewing story, because the answer is yes, you did find individuals who did that and had personal experiences and wanted to come forward. You also had others that just said bullshit. And then you had the others that, were really detrimental, saying, A, that could be, but B, that's the work of the devil. We do not want any involvement. And sometimes at very high levels, that got to be extremely detrimental. I do tell a story of, I keep blocking on the guy's name. He actually was one of the developers of the AIM-9 missile. And he had been DDR&E, the Deputy Director for Research and Engineering, which was very, very high level in the Pentagon, but it was running a research study on the outside. And I was asked to give the UFO 101 presentation, which I did, gave the whole thing and went down. And the people were, he asked, are there any questions? And a couple of people asked reasonable questions and that. And then all of a sudden he went high order, slammed on the desk and jumped up and said, "You're not supposed to know that. That's what you learn when you die." Wow. And I picked up my slide. I'm sorry, I thought we were in a scientific meeting here. He then went on, by the way, to describe the remote viewing program, and he and I were the only two in the room who understood what he was talking about, and he absolutely lied. And I knew about his personal experience in that area, and he absolutely, now he wouldn't have known that I already knew about it, but I knew enough to say, we had hit an emotional blockage with him. And I mean, this was a very vehement response. And he was, again, senior enough to, inhibit any potential research in these areas.
Actually, I've never asked you, Frank. Obviously, you weren't heading up a working group to deal with this type of thing. But during your time in the military, have you ever had people tell you stories about things they've seen in the sky and things they couldn't explain?
I can't comment on that, unfortunately.
Okay, no problem. But well, in your paper, a diagram is included that shows the similarities and differences between the Advanced Theoretical Physics Group and the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program that was ran by Luis Elizondo. And really, the only differences between the ATP and ATIP, at least from what I could see, were the levels of funding and institutional interest. I'd like to ask, was it simply due to the level of stigma involved in the research topics that led to a lack of funding and interest for the ATP? And why do you think ATIP managed to secure more funding and an increased interest?
Well, I give Lou great credit for that because I admit my failure to get funding. I might say we had finally got up and we just asking questions and trying to bring data together. And then I ended up with the head of SDI, which was Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars, which had a gigantic budget for the time of around $5 billion, which of course also made it a target for Congress, which was, and they were under threat. And the commander had no idea what we were talking about. In fact, we started, and I had people from several agencies with me, and he did not know the topic before we came in. It had been set up by an intermediary. And so he just was willing to take it. And we started, and about 10 minutes in, and I had been giving the discussion. He said, whoa, wait, who are you guys really? Could not believe that the people went around, reintroduced themselves. But the point was that he was, going to be in a position to monitor more of space. Remember what SDI was, the stop incoming missiles and various approaches, be it directed energy or kinetic kill or whatever that might be. But one of the key issues, of course, is that you want to make sure if you're going to shoot, you're shooting the right thing. And the potential for a mistake and you're on a hair trigger was high. But when we got done, and this was one where I did say, we would like to, formally establish a program. That was the difference. Mine was ad hoc. Lou was able to, have a formalized program. And his response was, quote, as a fighter pilot, I find this kind of interesting, but I don't dare touch this. He said, and the quote was, I'm doing some hairy stuff now, but if I get caught dealing in this arena, my budget is really at risk. Right. And he did get trimmed for $1 billion later, but the point was that they would not, the fear would be that they were not being seen as good stewards of, public resources. And you can understand that. Now, there was some changes. One difference in Lou's is that he had some angels. specifically Senator Harry Reid, well, in a way, and one other from Hawaii or from Alaska. And so they were sort of flying cover. The other is that the amounts of money that they were talking about, we're not even talking pocket change,
right,
by Pentagon standards. But it did get formal. I mean, that's good on them.
Yeah, could I just add to that? I have I mean, it's just a theory, but also if you look at the last 2 decades, the US military has been continually at war for the last 2 decades. So if we sort of theory and supposition that UAP and the intelligence behind them are interested in military activity and specifically strategic assets. There's also been a lot of movement, a lot of physical movement of vessels, of aircraft, units on the ground, a lot of electromagnetic radiation, talking signals and emanations and radars and activity, combat. You've got the Roosevelt story of UAP actually following the strike group out on deployment to the Middle East. So, I mean, if you were studying humans and you were interested in military capabilities, then conflict would be, the ideal place to monitor that. I mean, that's where, the weapons are tested out in battlefield conditions, and you find out actually if the weaponry that you've got is really, really effective, it's in the battle test.
Right. I would add two things to that. One is when you get into the nuclear arena, as we know, there have been a number of interactions there, and this goes back for decades again. And some would suggest there has been observation. Is the first commandment real? But there's an embargo against Earth because we were developing nuclear weapons and did not have the mental or ethical wherewithal to accommodate those. The other issue that it points out is that this notion that we have somehow developed this advanced technology and it's already available is just nonsense. I mean, and you can find things, guy we talked about earlier, dates back to, he's saying in the 50s and 60s that we've been flying such little widgets around. And I categorically reject that notion.
During the time period of the Advanced Theoretical Physics Group meetings, were you made aware of any government or private groups managing information related to crash recoveries or reverse engineering?
No. And I will say that this is an area where all of the data doesn't always fit together. Usually when you got back, there were some of the people we talked to separately. I mean, the ones I mentioned specifically, Edward Teller.
Right.
Yeah, okay. Teller, personal friend, had him over. This was after I left the military and was at Los Alamos, and had him over to discuss those issues. And our hypothesis was that 5 people were involved with Roswell, talking about specifically about Roswell now. Teller would have been one of them. And the reason was he was the guy who was dealing with the system that had the most energy known to man at that time. In fact, Lawrence Livermore was set up specifically for him to work in those areas. Clearly did not had interest, by the way. He didn't shoot me down at all and said, well, you're looking in the wrong place, and went into a lot of it on the development of the atomic bomb and what the parallels might be. But that, and another one was Ben Rich. If you know Ben.
Yeah. Well, not personally, but.
Yeah, well, we did. And similarly, that A, interest, B, had a shopping list. He actually assigned a guy to me that was doing some research into some of the groups that I could not have contacted at the time, and coming back and saying, no, I want the propulsion system. He had a list of things that he wanted for the advanced technologies for the aircraft that he was developing at the time.
So, just real quick, your opinion on Roswell. Do you believe that there was some sort of a anomalous crash of some sort, or
Well, I think Roswell absolutely did happen.
right?
Unfortunately, I come down on the side that I think it was ours. And I
Okay,
think that's been pretty well explained. And no, it wasn't a weather balloon or anything. And I think the Air Force studies on this have been absolutely abysmal. Particularly the reports that came out and said, case closed and that. The effort that went into those studies, although you get literally volumes that were published because of it, but it, but I do think that, and I've talked to some others, and some of these people we can't go into, but yeah, we know what it was. And by the way, the material that they're describing, remember that Jesse Marcel came out and described this mysterious stuff that he could grind up,
yeah,
and it would dissolve and it wouldn't burn and all that. That's all true. It was probably part of the material for the reasons that they described, and did exist at the time. And that one of the things he said where I know he's wrong is, remember, he was the G2 at Roswell. And physically, you got to remember, Roswell is right across from Wismar, the White Sands Missile Range, where a lot of these tests were ongoing. But when he said, because I'm the G2, I know everything, no, no, far from it.
Anything to add there, Frank, on just the concept of crash retrievals and whether or not there has been either with Roswell or a multitude of crashes, in your opinion?
Yeah, I was going to say. I mean, I keep an open mind on it, but the reading the Colonel's book and also the extensive interviews that I did with him, because I did more than one, and I kept on going back to bug him with more questions. If you read his book and also in the conversations and what comes out in the paper, he comes down against the idea of sort of like pulse weapons bringing them down.
Right.
Also as well about 1960s radars bringing them down, because the Colonel says, well, they would have had to survive the hell of a lot of radiation to get here from wherever. Yeah, I keep an open mind. I mean, there's been some claims that they've been brought down. Greer, for one, at the he makes claims that they were brought down with pulse weapons. But I immediately went to the Colonel with that. It was one of the first things that I did, and he's like, no, because he was responsible for those programs. But I think, I mean, yeah, at the end of the day, we don't know. But where's the technology that's come out of it? I would have to ask.
Well, but that's one of the critical issues. Because if you believed any of these things, to make little widgets that fly around are basically inconsequential compared to the real nugget, which would have been an energy source that we fundamentally do not understand to this day. And using it, again, to make these little widgets fly around is nothing compared to, doing away with petrochemicals and the changes in the energy systems that would, literally change the geopolitical structure of the world.
One theory that I have actually entertained, although I don't believe that this would fit every single purported UFO crash, but the idea that these vehicles are not crashing at all, that they are in actuality dropping technological breadcrumbs for humanity to pick up and study. So, I mean, what do you think about the idea of crashes being purposeful in order to drop something into our laps that would stimulate innovation or something like this?
Well, that's, of course, a step ahead of incompetence. But as far as that goes, I find that actually improbable. Having said that, we haven't really hit into, and I think is one of your components here, has to do with the fundamentals of consciousness. And because, as you know, in the talks that I give, I have a slide that begins initially that has remote viewing, near-death experiences, psychokinesis, firewalking, cryptozoology, etc., and UFOs, of course, and say, these things are all interrelated, and that consciousness appears to be a key component of it, and certainly human consciousness. Now, one of the things that you find, if you look at the history of even the UFO reports, and we talk about them being 1,000 years in advance, or however you hypothesize that. And what you find out is, no, that's not really true. That what you find is that, yes, they're advanced of where you are, but not well beyond your imagination. And that there is something feeding this capability. Now, if you want to make a huge leap into other areas, one with personal interest to me, and that's continuation of consciousness, and particularly the study here of Ibn Alexander, who was not a relative, but in a near-death study. Again, a neurosurgeon who was out for a week and should not have survived, and has this amazing set of stories that's proof of heaven that people want to read it.
Right.
But his point was that, levels of consciousness and civilization, and they were somewhere down here in the middle, and these things are there and may be accessed. Now, getting back to your question, does that mean somebody comes back and physically, or something, I guess, comes back and physically drops it in? Don't know, but we are finding that human consciousness and our thought processes are being stimulated on a continuous basis. And that is an evolutionary process. And do we make big leaps, or do we just kind of continue trucking along the way you do most of the time? And what you do find is periodically, again, you see step functions where new things come in and make major changes.
Sorry, just going back to, the seeding theory. I'd have to ask, well, first of all, like, who are they? Where are they from? When are they from, potentially? Because how do you assign any kind of intentions to them? Why would they, if we knew who they are or where they're from or when they're from, why would they be seeding technology? Is it because for some amusement, like, we do with ants, to see which pile the ants put the different colored bird seeds in? Or is it because, they want to see how fast we develop? Or is it because they've got a beef with some other group of others and they want humans to develop, potentially to be allies for them? There's just so many different kind of conjectures that you can make. It's very, very hard. When you look at terrestrial adversaries, like Iran, North Korea, China, you can look at their capabilities, you can look at their historical behavior, and also you can look at their stated intentions. Like, if it's Iran, we want to destroy Israel, or North Korea, we want to reunite the Korean Peninsula, or, the Chinese communists, we want to, bring Taiwan back into the fold. So they've actually made stated intentions, and you can take them pretty seriously at their word at that. But trying to assign motivations and intentions to others that you haven't even identified is very, very difficult to do.
Well, the big leap here, and this gets into quite philosophical, but one that I think is specifically germane, and that's the illusion of separateness, that the entities that Frank has just talked about are all separate and distinct,
right?
As opposed to being part of a greater whole that may not recognize that they are part of this. So when you ask the question, are they coming here delivering to us? What if they are us, again, at a conscious level, and are actually facilitating the evolution of our species that joins in a consciousness that always exists, and we were never separate from, though we have that illusion. And as Einstein would say, but a very powerful illusion.
Could I throw something in there? I was just going to say, whether you're talking the sort of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or you were talking, ultra terrestrials, interdimensionals, Michael Masters, extra tempestrials. There's so many different variations in craft, and then there's so many different, so many different looking occupants described. How many different variations are there in occupants, different species? Does that indicate that there are multiple different groups, assuming that we're not in some kind of illusion, or under some kind of psychological or emotional kind of mind control? And do these groups, if there are different groups indeed, do they have different agendas? There's so many different possibilities.
That's
Well,
all.
one of my original slides that I use in all of the UFO briefings, most of the others say, UFO, what do you mean? And specifically, this gets to Frank's issue here. I got little balls of light. I've got huge craft, miles across, physical, thousands and thousands of variations in between. This gets back to the question of why would you have so many of those things coming here if the ETH was the operative feature? That's the piece that does not make sense to me. But again, what does make more sense is, again, the evolution of human consciousness and the ability to kind of create these sorts of interactions, which would be almost infinite.
Well, I'd be tempted to agree with you on that side of it in terms of the facilitation of the evolution of human consciousness. But I mean, like we've just been saying, it's so frustrating that we have more questions than answers, and that will undoubtedly continue for quite some time in regards to just having more questions than answers. But I'd like to quickly steer this back into the advanced theoretical physics group because something that I wanted to bring up, and I know that Frank wanted to talk about this as well, and gauge your thoughts on this, Colonel. So much like the advanced theoretical physics group was so named in order to prevent FOIA requests on its objectives, a recent revelation that was presented in an article by a guy named Mark Secrecy shows that the US Navy and Department of Defense are deliberately manipulating information and terminology regarding UAP in order to obfuscate certain details from being accessible via FOIA requests. And
FOIA, you have to ask specifically what you're asking for, and if you don't know the words, then they can reject it. So
right, but there was a recent letter that came out that was basically showing that there was internal discussions about, to quote it, managing the overall messaging efforts, and it seemed to be, well, it's caused a bit of controversy on Twitter and so forth, because people are seeing that there is actually some internal discussions about, right, how do we keep certain things hidden, and how do we stop people from accessing certain things via FOIA. So I just wanted to kind of gauge your opinion on why is there still a concerted effort within the government to hide information and terminology regarding UAP from being accessed via FOIA requests?
Well, I think that's pretty simple. They don't know the answer, and it's embarrassing. And so you do not like to have people asking you questions of which you don't know about, or here you're having to admit that these incidents are occurring because people are now reporting it, and we have the videotape, and hopefully a number more that will be released. We're working on that now. But institutionally, yeah, it kind of hurts, don't like to be embarrassed.
Also, maybe, I mean, how much photocopying do you like doing? Because every time there's some kind of like flurry of FOIAs, I mean, it's got to be death by photocopier.
Well, another issue with FOIA, this is a generic one now, and that is that's not a position you put your best and brightest into. This is not career enhancing. These are not people that will be moving quickly up the food chain. And frankly, their motivation may not be the highest to get it out. But also, the UFO community has built a lot into that. In fact, got John Greenwald, who has done an admirable job of, persistency and getting some of the information out. I do think a lot of that, there's too much read into it. Again, it go internally. That within a few months to have a report that's supposed to be released. I suspect it will be marginal. When you equate this with all of the others, you start with just the Department of Defense. Frank mentioned earlier, been at war on a wartime footing for 2 decades now. We're a few months shy of that. What's biting you in the ass? UFOs are not among them, except maybe from the UFO community of things that I must solve. As opposed to all of the things. And the other thing, I think, from a technological standpoint, one of the things that does happen during periods of conflict is technology does evolve, and usually it gets accelerated. So if you take that hypothesis and you look at it and you say, well, what technologies have we seen that have come out since then? In aviation, the F-35, and we know how trouble that is. That's kind of about the realm there. You do see areas of prosthetics, robotics, micro everything. So those advantages have taken place. What you have not seen is anything big thing like anti-gravity or machines that fly around and autonomously. And again, as I point out, if we had that, the emphasis would be on the energy system, not on the widgets.
Yeah, sorry, could I just add to that? I mean, if you look at every kind of like, innovation of weaponry, yeah, whether it's from the stone axe to the crossbow to the longbow to gunpowder cannons, the tank, the jet engine, the ballistic missile, the nuke, the stealth fighter, anything that's viable eventually ends up getting used, right? Sooner or later. I mean, it might be kept under wraps for a while, but eventually ends up getting used. So that's one problem that I have with people who say that there's sort of fleets of anti-grav or these craft, because you would want to use them. I mean, why would you have your guys, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq getting blown up with IEDs and complex ambushes, ambushing the convoys? Why would you have that when you could just have like a triangular transport aircraft that drops off all the gear and just arrives kind of instantaneously and is pretty much impervious, and which then can double as a weapons platform, which is can loiter kind of indefinitely above the battlefield and take out bad guys?
Well, I might mention that one assignment I did have when still back on active duty, I was on a committee called Lightening the Soldier's Load. Lightening is making things later, not as getting lightning bolts. But the point is that has always been one of the problems of what you talked about, getting gear from one place to another, logistics. In fact, I was playing in the Chiefs war game, Air Force Chief of Staff war game down at Montgomery a number of years ago, looking at the conflicts. And frankly, it's logistics that are the long pole in the tent. So if you had these capabilities, you would have seen them applied. And yet, if you had the energy, it would be on a much broader scale. Would point out that we've done, studies on, okay, let's suppose you had a major breakthrough, say 0-point energy or something like that. That's going to be, it is going to take you 2 to 3 decades to inculcate that. I mean, you think now you go out and you can see it coming now with electric cars. How many places are you going to go where you have electric cars where I can recharge them? So think of that, creating that entire infrastructure and the capabilities necessary to do it. That takes decades. And you certainly would have been started now if you had something that's going to, again, change the whole geopolitical situation.
Well, let me play devil's advocate. And obviously, I'm sitting here with two people who would absolutely have a far more extensive understanding of like the logistics and what would be coming out in technology through the military. So you'll have to just forgive me for this. But could it not be the case, hypothetically, that these types of technologies are so exotic, so breakthrough, disruptive, groundbreaking, that it's just too risky to even let them out, because people would start asking questions outside of the military? The scientific communities might start going, well, hang on a second, we've been using chemical propulsion for so many years, and you're telling me that you've got these platforms. How is it working? Why are we not being allowed to study this? And so I was just, I'm just putting the thought out there that if it was such a disruptive technology, perhaps it's really best to just keep it so deeply under wraps. What are your thoughts on that?
Sorry, that doesn't make a lick of sense. and my point was, one of the things that has come up, and you hear this constantly, the better carburetor and all of that, that is the oil industries that would put it down.
Right.
Now, when you look at the broader scale, look at it from an economic perspective, they wouldn't put it down. They would own it. I mean, that's what they would do. The same people who own those things, yeah, there'd be a few winners and losers, but the people with the money, particularly in our system of predatory capitalism, Jeff Bezos would jump on that in a heartbeat.
But that's kind of my point. That's kind of my point. Jeff Bezos would jump on it in a heartbeat. So it's best to maybe keep it deep, deep, deep down in the military where Jeff Bezos can't ever see it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but remember, with one specific exception, and that's nuclear.
Right.
The nuclear energy, I don't know if you've heard, there's a category called formerly nuclear regulated. The point is that's the only industry that is, quote, born classified and then gets declassified. When you look at, and I used to do a lot of work, what we call the technology base, and that is where you're working, basic science, and then it eventually evolves and then gets integrated into engineering development, and at some point it evolves into a weapon system, if you will. But these things are coming across. If you look at technologies that are coming right now that make a lot more sense in danger, CRISPR, for instance, things you're doing with, the new vaccines that have come out, because what you can do with RNA and manipulation and that. Before, micro everything that has come along. Those are evolving out of the civilian sector and coming into the military, as opposed to, it's not to say military labs aren't, many of them, they have a number of awards because of the technology advances, but you don't see it kind of hidden. And in fact, I'd say anything that's going to affect the economy is something that should be in the civilian sector, because that's where it makes more sense. What Frank was discussing about China, I mean, the biggest thing that I see with China right now is that, the development that they've been making from an economic perspective. And you look at the Belt and Road and just the investment that they've made. Yeah, that's going to come from the civilian sector. The other thing we need to remember, of course, you're talking to an American here, and we think, Americans got the lead on everything. That's just not true. You got 1.3 billion Chinese, and some of them are very, very smart people. You mentioned the guy before. He was actually in China for a long time, and part of the work with the Chinese Academy of Science. And the reason that he was working there, one of them, was that they were that far advanced over what was happening here in the U.S. So, and I've had a big problem with a lot of the classification issues because science or physics and chemistry and that work the same for everybody. And I used to argue the Air Force would have classified electromagnetic as secret if given the chance. And overclassification, and I heard Lou talk to this, is in fact one of the major issues that we do have.
I'll just add to that, what the Colonel was saying. I mean, don't underestimate the Chinese. If you remember in the first paper I spoke to as well, Dr. Lanny Cass, who's a very, very smart academic, and she was also senior advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And, she said very much like, do not underestimate the Chinese, right? And she's always saying that, do not underestimate the Chinese. And I see that in conversations that she's having, with other people as well. I would say in terms of kind of like exotic technology and exotic platforms, well, first of all, don't underestimate human greed, because I've heard the argument, if it's hidden, if this exotic tech is hidden away somewhere in with an aerospace and defense company, well, if those guys can make money out of it, they will, right? So never underestimate that greed. And if you're talking, I've also heard the argument that, they want the USA to continue to use kind of like older platforms. Well, no, actually, because if you could offer some really sort of hyper sophisticated beyond next generation platform to the US military, of course, the US military would want to buy as many as they could, but they would only have a certain amount of budget. And I think you'd see it would be like with the F-22 and the F-35. You'd end up with some very advanced platforms, and then you wouldn't be able to buy as many of the F-35 and F-22, for example, as the US military wanted to. So what they do, they have to use legacy platforms or upgrade legacy platforms like F-15 and F-16 to complement those. So basically sort of 4.5 gen aircraft to complement the 5th gen aircraft. And I think that's what would happen as well if you had this exotic tech. You know, you wouldn't be able to, the US military wouldn't be able to buy enough of these exotic platforms to replace their whole legacy fleet. And also, as the colonel has said, I mean, it would take, you know, maybe a decade, 2 decades to actually bring those weapons online and to have the infrastructure to support those platforms, to have the pilots trained to be able to fly those platforms, assuming that they weren't, you know, completely autonomous. So there's, you know, there's a lot of other things in play here.
I think the average time on development of a weapons system from engineering development, meaning we know how to do this, to a fielded system is about 15 years. And that's given you know how to do it.
Yeah, I think the other issue as well, I mean, which is a big thing that I've touched on in both the papers, is you know, the kind of like the weaponry. Okay, so you've got a platform that flies, but then what do you actually equip it with? Have you got some kind of like, you know, advanced lasers, you know, directed energy weapons, whatever it is, or are you going to equip it with more legacy type weapons, like, you know, sort of you know, with cannons, with missiles, or figure it out for some other mission, like, you know, electronic intelligence or, you know, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So it's the issue of what you put on the platform as well.
Frank, you bring up an important point actually in this first paper regarding the ATP and then ATIP, which is that it would seem that the Department of Defense essentially reinvented the wheel because the scope of the ATP, its overall objective, seems to correlate directly with the mission statements of ATIP, going even further back in time as well, before, John, before you established the ATP. In 1954, when the US Air Force updated its UFO reporting manual, the objectives at that time were to ascertain whether or not UFOs represented a threat to national security interests of the United States, and secondly, to determine the technical aspects involved in the flight characteristics, overall capabilities of UFOs. So if we look at this logically, it would seem that since 1954, we have been chewing over the same problem relating to national security and technological superiority, which begs the question, why are we seeing this being publicly addressed now? Why not before? I mean, obviously we've had certain things being addressed, but there's a real rollout happening now. So I'd like to start with you, John. Why do you think there is a concerted effort to get this out into the mainstream now?
Hey, there's not.
Well, maybe not a concerted effort, but
at least a concerted effort to get it out.
At least a higher interest.
A reluctant effort to do, you know, get some information out. No, I think what's happened, and you mentioned 2 programs. My guess is there's probably a couple other pockets, and that they're small enough and they go along, and you get back to the individual interest where you have people who are interested enough and have access to some level of resources. Now, what we were doing, very minimal in that, you know, I had my salad, but I want to emphasize, I had a day job, you know, at the same time.
Right.
I was you know, working other things on
just
doing
UFOs
basis,
at night.
and I was doing this, and, you know, but remember, you're running your average 70-hour week anyway. So, yeah, I'm saying the citizens are not getting screwed out of their, you know, money's worth because people will do that. But you have people who are interested. You have incidents from time to time that are compelling. You look at Fata Giant, 67 incidents with the nuclear thing. I mean, that caused an uproar. I know, but the problem is that you ended up going, what the hell? You know, we don't understand, and it's so far beyond this. We keep coming back and looking at it. Are they making some progress? Yeah, probably. I think the biggest thing that the ATP and this study will come forward is we have better sensor systems now. And so you will add data that starts your more or less defining the parameters of what you want to study. I don't think, again, if I'm correct, and that consciousness is a piece of this, this is definitely going to stay a step ahead. And I came up with a phrase called the precognitive sentient phenomena. And the point there was that we were studying certain things, but there was a, I hate to call it, I don't know how to describe it, a supernumerary that was definitely in charge. And it seemed to know how we would respond to phenomena before the observation took place. It was certainly sentient, it was certainly smarter than us, and phenomenological. And all was one step ahead. Every time we get close and start to study, you say, oh, you like that? Try this. Now you're seeing similar sorts of things in the UFO phenomena as well, as it morphs enough to stay ahead of whatever sensors or data collection systems that we have, and it changes over time. Sometimes to meet our expectations, other times it totally changes our perception of what we're trying to observe.
Frank, anything to add on just the idea of why there's so much discussion happening now, especially within the mainstream, pushing this out?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it goes back to the point I made about being sort of at war for 2 decades. A lot more military activity. So you've got large deployments in space, in the air, on the ground, on the surface of the ocean, subsurface. And also, I mean, not just American platforms as well, but also adversary platforms, because, when you've got the Americans going on deployment, whether it's, Indo-Pacific region or going to the Gulf, they're going to be shadowed by Russian vessels or Chinese vessels, or if it's in the Gulf, Iranian vessels. Okay. So you've got a lot of military hardware and a lot of personnel and a lot in close proximity and a lot of emissions. And I agree with, the Colonel was saying about there's the sort of better sensing capabilities as well. I mean, now in the civilian sphere, you've got Sky Hub. So you've got technologies that were once the exclusive purview of the military, which are now seeping out which have seeped out into the civilian world. And I think, more encounters because of that, because the sensors are better and because there's been a lot more activity. So I think the US Navy especially has been very, very concerned because they are more expeditionary. So with the US Marine Corps, so they're in a lot more different places. Obviously, the Air Force is more static unless they're operating from a a forward airfield. But the Navy is moving around a lot more, and it's in the air, it's on land with the Marines, it's surface, it's subsurface. So I think there's been a lot more encounters, and that's why.
Well, the other thing to remember, let's use Syria as an example. One of the biggest problems in Syria, if you look at all the competing forces that are in the area, deconfliction is one of our main issues. And being able to determine, what's happening, so you don't want to make a mistake in having a phenomenological event versus an incursion of some kind. I might mention, this is one of the areas that may come down. I guess Jacques and I we generally agree, but this is one where, the explanation as to how certain things happen, according to them, says we would have invaded the UK. I'm thinking here of crop circles where they come down and say we have some kind of beam weapon that, draws all the hieroglyphs and all of that. I would point out if we had such a capability, as Frank has pointed out, yeah, you would have used it for things other than drawing pictures in cereal crops. And the other is, this would have been basically an armed invasion of the United States against what's supposed to be our closest ally.
Can I gauge your opinion real quick on crop circles? Obviously, there's undoubtedly a lot of fake ones, but what's your opinion on crop circles?
Well, I think you just gave it. There are some fake ones, but having said that, there certainly have been some that defy explanation. The ones up near the Stonehenge, where you saw one that appeared in 90 minutes with 90 some separate sub-elements that were put in, and just definitely defies explanation. But that's the type of thing where the explanation was, well, we've got beam weapons that we can do this with. And if we got beam weapons, I got places to use those.
Yeah,
and
not in English
you would have
fields.
seen that, much more likely to see it in Iraq and Afghanistan or other areas of the Middle East, and making nice drawings and pissing off your farmers.
Colonel, you've said before that you don't consider these phenomenon as a threat due to the fact that their technological capabilities are so far ahead of our own that they could have defeated humanity anytime they wanted and could still do so today. And I agree with this point of view. But one thing I would put to you is the idea that this could be a long game manipulation. There are those that believe the establishment of world religions was precipitated by these phenomenon, and that this in of itself led to bifurcation and conflict amongst humanity. And some proponents of the UFO conversation, such as Tom DeLonge, say that there are essentially good gods and bad gods. What are your thoughts on the possibility of there being multiple conflicting agendas from different beings or intelligences that have impacted our world in a way that's caused conflict?
Reptilians versus the Nordics?
Well, it's
gray guys? Or?
Is it simply that they could destroy us, but they haven't, therefore they're not a threat? Or could it be more of a multi-dimensional chess game, essentially?
I think that's taking it too far. Remember, if you're familiar, I'm sure, with the Condon report.
Yeah.
And you have the Condon report that followed that in the UK. And what people mistake there is the question to Condon was not, are UFOs real? It was the one you're posing, were they a threat? And, we have not been ostensibly invaded. That brings an interesting question. I'm talking about that. I'm talking a la Hollywood, UFOs come in and shoot beams down, and the end of the world scenarios and whatnot. You get into the philosophical area now, and we're talking about demons and angels and all that. I'm putting it into your religious context. I think that is one that's well beyond the technological discussion that we're having here on UFOs, and very philosophical. Again, my background in near-death experience with thanatology and whatnot, and looks at that. And you are hearing, again, if I go back to Eben and others talking about, levels of consciousness and interaction, that said there are levels that are beyond our imagination at this point, let alone trying to sort this out. And yet you do find, again, in organized religions, it's not uncommon to have demons, jinns, whatever interaction. I also see this as potentially part of human consciousness sort of thing. There are things called tulpas. I'm familiar with the Tibetan Buddhism, where you intentionally create thought forms. And of course, one of the things they suggest there that A, you can do it, but B, very hard to control. That eventually these things get out of control and cause other sorts of problems and whatnot. I have worked extensively in psychokinesis, and this is the mind-matter interaction, and certainly we demonstrated. You can see right above me here actually are some of those sorts of materials. Not sure which one, but where humans have interacted with physical material in ways that we do not understand and seemingly defy the laws of conservation of energy as to how these things could occur. So that's there. The problem, as I see it, and where we're taking the discussion, is it gets so convoluted, so intertwined, that it takes an awful lot to understand the possibilities. And the other issue is that, as you mentioned, religions have grown up with all this and created dogma. I'll throw in one anecdote here. When I was doing my doctorate, the head of my committee was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. who was the one who brought hospice to the United States. She and Ray Moody brought forth the whole notion of near-death experiences. She brought the 5 stages of death and all of that. And she made me change one word in the study that I was on, the thing you put in your proposal for your dissertation. And that was from religious to spiritual. And that had a huge change. And how many people have come in and say, I consider myself to be a spiritual being. I'm not religious. I reject the dogma of the church. Some people say, like the ceremonies and all that. But religion, in my view, has become a huge obstacle in many areas. I know it's a comfort to many people, and that's fine. But in many of these areas, and it applies in the UFO phenomena as well as many others, they want to be the arbiter of truth. And it's a control mechanism of, we're going to control the information. We will tell you what these things are and what they mean, and it fits within the hierarchy as we know it. That's probably going to get us into trouble. It goes out to, discuss those things. But you just run into so many variants that now you want to go back and say, did Ichi create the divisions in the religions to see where that goes and how humans respond? Are we part of a big experiment?
Well, that's the reason I brought it up is because specifically Tom DeLonge was someone that had said that he was apparently told this, that there are quote unquote good gods and bad gods, and that there's this whole kind of, warring faction. And it's not something that I particularly subscribe to, but I just thought that it was worth bringing up because it was something that he claimed to have been quite literally told by insiders.
Hardly new. I mean, you do hear it in the UFO genre as well, but you do find that in religion.
Well, I chuck in a couple of theories there. Why haven't we been attacked, or why hasn't there been a full-on invasion, military assault on Earth, as it were? Assuming that we knew who they were and where they were from, when they were from, and could ascertain their intentions. But you got various theories. So it could be sort of like a blip of time theory. They haven't got around to destroying us yet. It may be for the last 70 years for them is like, I don't know, a couple of days or a week, and they've just started seeing blossoming, atomic explosions on Earth. And they're like, right. Okay, those apes are getting a bit tasty now. Technologically, they're moving into space, and they've got atomic weapons, and they're developed, directed energy weapons, and they could be a problem for us. A threat to us or our objectives. Balance of power theory, where maybe the subject of scrutiny by various different intelligences, but neither one, they don't allow each other to destroy us. In a sort of a balance of power. Or maybe there's the sort of clandestine theory, if you want to go full on David Jacobs. That there's hybridization program that's all going on clandestinely, that's perpetrated by ETs who want to hybridize us and enslave humankind and replace us with hybrids, as he calls them, and that they've got hostile designs on us and humans, but they do this in secret for some reason. So why do they do it? Because if they've got all this advanced technology, why don't they just do it overtly? Is it because they want to have the planet and they don't want to damage the planet? They don't want to kill off humans completely because they want to enslave them? I mean, there's whole lot of different questions that come out of those. Is it the real estate that they want, and they want to get rid of humans completely eventually? I mean, there's so many different questions that you can ask in that regard.
Yeah, but that's quite simple. And the approach would be VW. Rather than coronavirus, you would come up with something that's far more lethal and takes out. From the experiment standpoint, I would say, if you want the bad news, remember when we do experiments with series of white mice, when they get done, they are sacrificed. So I hope that we're nearing that point where they're going to decide to sacrifice Earth as a failed experiment.
Or like the TV, those two TV series V, where they were actually a food source.
Oh yeah.
to serve men.
Yeah. Now, just to bring it back into the papers, a quote from yourself, Colonel, that was included in Frank's paper was as follows: As for the extraterrestrial hypothesis, I'm not a fan, as you know. In my opinion, it's just too simple an explanation. That does not mean there are not real encounters with entities of some sort. My point is that there have been reports of encounters between humans and sentient non-human entities throughout the entirety of human history and in almost all cultures. That they arrive in little tin cans, UFOs, is a relatively new aspect. Now, although I do agree with you again that the ET hypothesis is too simple of an explanation when you consider the wide scope of observed phenomenon throughout time, there are actually some fascinating depictions from artworks of antiquity of what would appear to be disc and oval shaped craft. And so to me, it seems as if at least some aspect of this phenomenon that is utilizing these types of platforms has in fact been present throughout human history. What are your thoughts on some of the paintings that seem to depict quite clearly metallic discs or oval shaped objects in the sky, paintings from way back?
I remember Alexander when he was invading in the Middle East or Southwest Asia. They report having seen a craft come down and fly across and that. So it's not that there haven't been many, but you don't hear the complete repetition that you have started, we did starting in the 70s. And I do think that there's suspect that, again, consciousness, as we have reported these over and over again, you see more people seeing. Now, does that mean that they've always been there? One of the problems we have is determining, has it always been there and just not reported? Or are there, in fact, more events that are happening? I do think that from, again, the technological advancements that have been made, our consciousness in those areas is advancing, and will probably mean that the kinds of craft and things that are reported are, more technologically advanced. Now, you talked about, and something that appears on in orbs, and haven't brought that up here, but I have a friend who has written in these areas, who came down and saw one of these things floating inside his house, and things that happen. There's a time distortion. In this case, Ray had a little dog that was very ill and old and whatnot. The dog and his wife disappears. He goes back upstairs and goes to bed, says he can't explain that. After seeing the same, comes back, and here's the dog, totally acting like a puppy. The wife remembers, going off and not much of the encounter. The guy that I have written to is Chris Bledsoe. And what I liked about that case, the reason I wrote to it is because this is my second personal encounter sort of thing. But he has this terribly complex encounter, started out a few years before. He and some guys are down fishing. The whole story takes hours, but they're, the generic parts. He comes up and he sees this thing floating. He disappears. He comes back. They had built a fire. The fire is dying out. They say, "Where have you been?" He thinks it's 20 minutes. It's been hours. Little creepy crawlers come around and chase him. UFOs flying over, shooting things down. He goes back to the house. ET shows up at his window. He goes running off. The ET, this being, chases him. He thinks he's being captured, and the entity says telepathically, "You don't understand, we're here to help," and then disappears. The next morning, he's around noon, he goes, "Gee, I haven't taken my medicine." Turns out he had Crohn's disease, and so he had a spontaneous healing, by the way. He has not taken his medicine in all of the intervening years. Why would I believe any of that? Years later, I'm there visiting him, and we're out at the spot where the incident occurred. And he goes, "Oh, I think they're here." And within a few seconds, this thing popped into view above us and went shooting off. And it was a temporal relationship between him saying, "I think they're here." Now, when you look at this case, if you thought of it from a purely logical standpoint, none of it makes sense. I mean, you've got craft that are showing up, the spontaneous healing, time, abductions, etc. And yet, the physical things seem to have happened. Now, he's one that has continued contact. In fact, I just heard from him the day again, and it's the orbs in contact. He has orbs that are coming, and he thinks sending information to him and continuing to do healings for, he doesn't know, with other people as well.
Now, before we move on to the second and most recent paper by Frank, I want to quickly touch on Skinwalker Ranch and the concept that you put forward in your book, John, regarding what you call, which you've mentioned just a moment ago, precognitive sentient phenomena at Skinwalker, which you studied when you worked for Robert Bigelow. An example of this type of phenomena is the very real issue of cattle mutilation. You address one case of this type of mutilation, which took place in broad daylight and within 300 meters of and in the direct line of sight of a rancher. You were quoted to say the following: "As inconceivable as it seems, the best explanation was that the mutilation actually took place at another location and the body returned. Only two alternatives allow for that scenario: an invisible UFO or interdimensional interaction, and both exceed our understanding. This is a case in which PSP proved to be completely in charge and absolutely malicious." Now, did you assess that there was a high level of threat to humans at Skinwalker Ranch, given the PSP's capabilities for harm? And did you or anyone else you were working with at the time experience what's been classified as hitchhikers?
Classified as what?
Hitchhikers, when something comes back with you from the ranch.
That actually came along later. Do we feel threats at the time? No. Did not. Well, having said that, since Brandon took the ranch, they have reported, in fact, the ranch foreman has reported having a serious head injury, getting hospitalized on more than one occasion. One of the things that Bob himself, Bigelow, has mentioned now in a very recent interview with George Knapp, and he had told me that his wife asked him to sell the ranch, and that he describes an incident where, after being up there, that he's back at the house, he's sound asleep, and Diane said she woke up and here's this faceless entity just hovering right above her.
Wow.
Very, very scary. And like I say, this is the first time that I've heard him talk about this publicly. There are others who have said, yeah, things followed them home. Not a lot specific on that. But this is not uncommon I'd say in a range of phenomena where people have been dealing with poltergeists. In fact, I'll give you an example. Again, in Reality Denied, I tell the story of a traveling poltergeist. Was married to a woman who had 3 kids, and there was a poltergeist that followed us. It started initially in Hawaii, happened again. It seems to be following again, teenage girls. This is not uncommon with poltergeist phenomena to the Carmel area. We're at Fort Ord for a short time, and then on to Atlanta. We had a number of incidents. Give an example, one of them we did do a session that is in the next season of The Secrets of Skinwalker Ranch. So.
Okay.
But we did that like we are.
Right.
So,
would you ever go to the ranch, Frank?
I think it's one of those things that you'd have to do. I think you'd have to do.
Yeah.
But, obviously, find out how you can take some precautions about, not bringing some phenomena some phenomenon back with you that sticks around and is unpleasant, you need to know how to deal with that.
Yeah.
Remember, we've dealt with shamans all over the world. If you're familiar with ayahuasca in particular, with many ceremonies throughout South America. We have an occasion, again, one that's mentioned in my chapters on Brazil, where my wife was fully possessed. This happened to be an Umbanda ceremony, but no drugs involved. But something, discarded entities stepped in, took over her body for a period of time, and eventually went away. And that was one of the questions that we're still asking is, did everything leave at the time? So she was agreeable to the, the first incident, not necessarily for continuing contact.
I want to move into Frank's most recent paper. Now, I was fortunate enough to gain an hour's window with Luis Elizondo to speak with him on record about different areas of the UFO issue. And Frank, you were kind enough to include many of these exchanges between myself and Lou in this latest paper that's titled American Development of UAP Technology, a fait accompli. Now, I'm not going to go through every question and response that was included in the paper, but I will highlight some particular interesting responses from Lou and just open it up for discussion. So the first response I wanted to highlight is the one that Lou gave to my question regarding the now quite infamous ATIP presentation slide 9, wherein it details the existence of a science or technology that has the ability to, amongst other things, manipulate both cognitive and physical environments, as well as the manipulation of the very fabric of the space-time construct. Now, although Lou's response was brief, it was to me at least quite profound, because he simply responded by saying, I think that's a fair assessment, when I basically said, is this what this is? Is it, manipulation of the entire fabric of space-time? And he said, I think that's a fair assessment. Now, one thing I find interesting is that Lou has repeatedly stated that this phenomenon represents a potential threat, keyword being potential. He has never stated that the phenomenon represents a direct threat or should be considered an enemy. And yet within the ATIP slide, it clearly states the following: a science exists for an enemy of the United States to manipulate both physical and cognitive environments in order to penetrate US facilities, influence decision makers, and compromise national security. So my question to both of you here is, what enemy do you think is being referred to here? Because if the position of Lou and therefore ATIP is that the phenomenon cannot be directly considered a threat or an enemy, would this not maybe suggest that the language being used in this ATIP slide is actually referring to a human adversary that has this capability?
Not necessarily. Are you in the Church of England?
No.
The reason I ask, now, we went back to the Against Theoretical project. When I was doing that, we did exactly the same thing that Lou was doing. Remember, they're dealing with the Department of Defense, and the Department of Defense funds things that are threats. And so if you want to get money, you define something as a threat, not just here's an interesting idea that we want to explore. You can easily make that. Now, the question is, if somebody else had a quantum leap in technology, would that be of concern? Absolutely. But when I ask about the religion, because we have no expectation generally that the Department of Defense or Ministry of Defense, in your case, would be involved with ghosts, with poltergeists, with any range of phenomena. You don't even think that they would be involved. And yet we have an expectation that they ought to be involved in the UFO phenomena. Other things are seen and periodically and dismissed. But if, as what they're trying to do, and I applaud the effort, by the way, if you want to get funded and have a formal program, you must by definition have a threat. Counter on that, when I was growing up, and this was the bad Soviet bad old days, if you will, one of the issues were the problem of 10-foot tall Russians. And we kept building up, the R&D community, hypothesizing the threat. And one of them I talk about is FST-3. That stood for Future Soviet Tank 3. Now the FST-1 did become the T-91 or T-92. But obviously the Soviet Unions have not gone on to this real ridiculous complex threat that could have existed. But to justify funds in that area, you certainly wanted a threat that
Right.
you could get the funds for.
So you think it boils down just to a funding mechanism, basically?
Well, and like I say, when I was doing HAP, I did the same thing.
Right.
It says you've got to hypothesize a potential threat, and it was two things. A, we would like to have this capability and what it would do for us, and potential against our aviation assets in particular, and whether or not they're going to be spending money on this. How do you get somebody to spend those kinds of resources unless you can show that what's your ROI going to be, the return on investment? How are you going to do this, and can I justify this? So you've got to have at the lower levels, the level of justification is less, quite frankly. But if, as Frank knows, if you're going to justify an F-35 or the future, and we're already talking about next generation bombers and things like that, then you've got to say, what's the function you want it to do and against what threat? How's it going to be applied? And then you start talking really big dollars. Lower levels, yeah, you can muck about millions or tens of millions maybe, but depends on where you think. Now, I think, by the way, I do talk about this research and what it costs. A person day in space right now is $7.5 million. If you take the Large Hadron Collider, looking at that was about 11 billion to start, about $1 billion a year to run after that, with interest to a few theoretical scientists. We're talking, if you get into this kind of basic research and the areas that I think you're going to need to understand these things, mega bucks, billions and billions of dollars, which means you're going to be able to have to justify that kind of expenditure at the highest levels of government and convince the public that this is where they want their money to be spent.
Well, that actually segues quite nicely into what I want to ask next about essentially, well, something I put forward to Lou was the fact that Dr. Eric Davis has repeatedly stressed the importance of the 38 defense intelligence reference documents that came from the precursor program of ATIP, which was the Advanced Aerospace Weapon Systems Applications Program, in regards to extrapolating the physics and engineering of 2009 out to 2050 to determine whether or not we can approximate the capabilities of UAPs in a scenario where the UAP might become a future threat. Now, my question to Lou was about how realistic this time frame given by Davis for the US to achieve these capabilities would be, and how likely it would be to convince Congress to allocate the money for a huge kind of Manhattan Project style effort to get there. And his response was that the timeline is not up to him, and that Congress and the government is going to respond if they feel there is an interest by the people to do so, saying that if the interest is there, that the US would lead the charge in doing this research and making sure it was properly resourced. So my question to both of you is, how do we make this happen? How do we get the decision makers to lead the charge on this effort to research and develop these technologies and study the phenomenon?
My guess is you don't. And if you will remember, we have just passed a $1.9 trillion unfunded bill. It was the COVID relief package. If that's on top of 2 trillion before, you got about 5 trillion that has just been thrown out in the last few years. So my guess is that R&D, now research and development has kind of always been what we call a bill payer. And what we mean by that is that when you start looking for money, you're not going to invent it. That was one of my favorite phrases in the Pentagon. It says, I'm going to go find the money. But what that means is I'm going to go raid somebody else's project. So you have enough things to do that it means that you're going to have higher and higher scrutiny over whatever projects come in. It is a zero-sum game. And when you do, describe this, we have a one-to-N list of priorities for research and development, and starts with things that you must do in order to defend yourself, and then things that would be nice to do, and then it descends down there. Well, you run out of money probably before you run out of things you must do. So if you're going to do this, and like I say, I said the Manhattan Project, I think, and I think our figure was what, 22 billion, incomparable now. To convince people that you're going to use that kind of funding, I think is negligible, and particularly in the current environment.
I would agree with that. I mean, if you look across the board, I mean, the US, the ground forces and the Air Force of the United States, whether you're talking about whether it's the Marines, the Navy, the US Air Force, have been heavily involved, right, in counterinsurgency, right, not just the Army and the Marines on the ground. So in some ways, in a lot of ways, actually, China and Russia have used this to play catch up in some technologies in some areas, and in some areas, the American ability to fight kind of what they used to call near peer adversaries, and which are more like peer adversaries now in China's case, has atrophied to some extent. So America's got to now still maintain its ability to fight counterinsurgency, but also as well, it's got to go back to sort of conventional war fighting against a large peer opponent. If you look at the U.S. Navy, has been in a terrible state because of training, because of equipment issues. Okay, so you've got to meet the China threat. The Chinese Navy has grown exponentially, so you've got that threat in the Indo-Pacific. China's got all kinds of claims in the region. Not so long ago, Russia invaded the eastern part of Ukraine. The Baltics are sitting feeling very vulnerable at the moment. So there's the troublemakers like North Korea and Iran, haven't gone away. China's looking at Taiwan. There's tensions with India. There's tensions between Pakistan and India as well. So, America's got a lot of kind of immediate problems and immediate sources of threat on the horizon before you even get to like the UAP issue.
Well, I think people forget that within the UFO community. I mean, we're such a niche, and people are kind of in such a bubble. And if you're within the UFO community, obviously you recognize the importance of addressing this issue. But I think people need to be realistic and look outside of that and see what are the tangible threats and issues that are being faced by the Americans today and by other countries such as ours. And UFOs are not going to figure into that priority list right now, even as much as we would like them to. So it's a good point to bring up, and I appreciate the response from both of you on that. And I'm going to move into a slightly more abstract question, but this was something that was included in your paper as well, Frank. In an interview with Andy, the host of that UFO podcast, Lou gave us some pretty fascinating ideas on time, actually, how these phenomena may be interacting with time through different viewpoints to our own. And I'll quote what Lou said. I've got it here. He said, "We live in a three-dimensional world where time is a function of the fourth dimension, and we experience time as linear. But we now know in the quantum world that space and time are joined together, and we know that space-time is flexible. It is called relativity, and we see it around a mass of objects all the time, and not just in Earth. So the linear universe that we experience, to some degree, really isn't. What if there were things that had the ability to experience a much bigger transition where more elements of the future and the past are experienced as in the present?" And can do that also physically? What if there were species out there that experience the universe with an extra level of dimension? So I'd like to get both of your thoughts on this idea that these phenomena may not be experiencing time in the same way as we do, and what that might mean regarding their technology and even their origins. I mean, obviously, we're speculating here, and it's always 20 questions with pretty much zero answers. But do you think that there's any possibility that we could be looking at time travelers?
I think if you look at Dr. Michael Masters' theories
Yeah.
on hominid evolution, I mean, he's obviously eminently qualified as well. But his book, I just remember the title.
Oh, I've got it somewhere.
Yeah, Identified Flying Objects, a multidisciplinary scientific approach to the UFO phenomenon, which I quoted in the book. I mean, that is pretty compelling. I mean, as a theory. So I wonder, though. I mean, is it something that's technological, i.e., the ability to move through time using some kind of constructed craft, or is it something more to do with sort of consciousness and the actual being or beings themselves, that they somehow occupy different physical and temporal locations simultaneously? I'm not a scientist, so it's kind of quite difficult for me to theorize, but it seems to me that there's different possibilities here.
Yeah, I guess I would address it a little differently, and that is one of the getting back to continuation of consciousness and near-death experiences. One of the ubiquitous things they say is there is no time. I mean, people talk about reviewing their entire life, and in our time, that might have been seconds. And in their time, it says the time as we know it does not exist.
Right.
From a practical standpoint, the reason I know that it is not true is whatever it is, they would own the U.S., the country, the world, whatever. I say here that there are trading, with the automated trading capabilities that go on now. There's a few algorithms that will give you advantages in hundredths of a second in trades, and it is enough to make a constant profit. If you could advance just 1 second ahead and apply to this, and I'll get back to Frank's comment on universal greed, if you will. Yeah, you would know them, unless Bezos is a time traveler, with Amazon. That's about the closest thing that you come. So I don't see that happening. Having said that, every indication are that there are dimensions in which time as we know it, and we tend to think of it, by the way, moving from left to right. I'm not sure why, but that's kind of a mental progression on it. Just appears not to be consistent.
Now, Lou also mentioned one of the conclusions of the ATIP program was that all of these observables exhibited by the phenomenon, whether it be instantaneous acceleration, transmedium travel, anti-gravity, etc., are possibly all expressions of a singular technology instead of a variety of technologies being deployed that have these different effects. Do either of you agree with Lou's comments that all of these incredible feats are likely to be applications of just one singular technology?
I personally don't know, because I haven't had access to what he's had access to. So I'm kind of keeping an open mind about that one. But he does also as well go on to say that if a foreign adversary had even one of those technologies, that it would be game changing.
Game over.
So yeah. If somebody, managed to get hold of that technology and it encompassed all the different observables, then, you'd be onto a winner. Or a loser if the adversary.
Hey, when I talk about it, I talk about phenomena as in plural, because I think that's what the observations tell us.
Now, he was also quoted again in your paper, Frank, to say that we're getting closer to understanding the potential physics behind these things, going on to say that he cannot go into details, but that he thinks we're getting closer to that prize that closer to that prize than most people think. Now, when I had Lou on record, I asked him whether or not he ever located programs that were working on the reverse engineering of non-terrestrial craft, to which he responded by saying, I can't answer that question, unfortunately, going on to say that he doesn't mean to be vague or evasive, but that he can't answer that. Now, just for me personally, that kind of response seems to suggest that he did come across such programs. And I just want to gauge your thoughts on this. How far do you think we've come in the black world? I mean, we have kind of covered this, but just because of the fact that Lou Elizondo gave this comment, I mean, John, do you think that he was just saying no, he hasn't come across them, but or was he trying to hint that perhaps there was some reality to it and that he did stumble across programs that were covering this type of thing?
Well, we do know that Air Force, for instance, does have RFPs out for anti-gravity.
Right,
so
right.
that there are programs that are working in this advanced stealth, which is basically signal suppression. There's definitely programs in such areas. I would like to drop back though, when you say that, anybody is saying we are close to understanding the physics. I just don't believe that. I think it's like saying, I understand this little finger, so therefore I understand human health. That's the things that are talking about. They keep talking about tic tac and the gimbal, the things that have been specifically observed. That is such a tiny fraction of the entire breadth of technologies that have been observed. I think it's ludicrous to say, and therefore we will be able to answer all of these other things.
Yeah, I think if you look at, I don't know, for example, the jet engine. I mean, the Brits were looking at the jet engine, I think, as early as 1936. But understanding how a jet engine might work is a very different thing from actually being able to build a jet engine that actually works and doesn't, rip itself apart at excessive revolutions, and then actually fitting it to an aircraft that will fly safely and do what you want it to do. And, it took a few more years for that to happen. So I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if Elizondo said that to, I don't know, potentially make adversaries think that, right, the United States is further along the line. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, he worked for years and years in the US government, and he is a patriot, and he's a CI guy as well, right? So he'll be up on his OPSEC and his deception plans. But I think that was very interesting what he said. I just don't know. And I mean, it's one thing understanding and even knowing how to build a platform, but then it can still take years and years to build a platform. I mean, aside from the technology, the bureaucracy involved. I mean, look how long it's taken to build, the F-22 and the F-35. If you look at the Project Condign report, there's a section in the UK's Project Condign report, which came out in, I think it was published in 2000. And they're saying they showed some platforms that potentially could be confused with UAP. So they had pictures of the F-35 or the F-35X, I think it was called then. So, that was 2 decades ago, right? So it still takes a long time, like the kind of bureaucratic inertia and the contracts and everything else to get these things actually up and running.
And beside the way, what you're saying there is, and there's a huge difference between saying I have a platform that works, and we would call an operational capability, which means I've got a fleet of them, a wing or a squadron or whatever level of those. And then you have the trade-offs that you mentioned earlier. Says, okay, I can do that, but they cost X amount, and X is huge, but I need, hundreds of capabilities. So I'm willing to take technology that is much lower, but within reasonable cost.
During Frank's preparation for his second paper, you both discussed at length the threat posed by China to American global preeminence. Senator Harry Reid's ATIP letter to the Deputy Secretary of Defense in 2009 said, specific methodologies used to study unconventional technology may require nuanced approaches that will undoubtedly be of significant interest, if not a top priority for adversarial foreign intelligence security services. Ultimately, the results of ATIP will not only benefit the US government, but I believe will directly benefit the Department of Defense in ways not yet imagined. Sorry. The technological insight and capability gained will provide the US with a distinct advantage over any foreign threats and allow the US to maintain its preeminence as a world leader. Taking these statements from Senator Reid into account, how interested do you think China will be in developing UAP technologies, and how likely do you think it is that they might get there before the Americans, assuming, of course, that there is a US program in place to develop these technologies, as Lou Elizondo seems to be aiming for?
I think the piece that's missing and the main advantage they have is continuity. Our problem is we keep shifting course. So you've seen what's happened with the last election, and we finally agree that science is important again. China doesn't have that disadvantage. They can say, and if you look at what they're doing, by the way, in 5G technology, facial recognition, robotics, I mean, they have said these are national priorities and have both the wherewithal and funding and resourcing and the political will, because they can say this is what we're going to do. In the US, we'd kind of just muck about and have a study to study it.
I think, yeah, that Chinese would be extremely interested in it. Anything that provides kind of dominant battle space awareness, as Chris Mellon suggested. And if they will be watching the UAPTF, and they'll be very interested in American research in this area, anything that can give them a leg up. The problem the Chinese have at the moment is, if you look at their 5th gen fighter, they're still using a Russian 1980s turbojet, okay? Because the Russians don't want to give them the engine technology, because so far the Chinese have been producing like knockoffs of Russian aircraft, right, and Russian tanks, effectively, and Russian vehicles, and selling those on the cheap to their clients. And there's a lot of espionage that goes on against the Russians by the Chinese, despite their ostensibly outside kind of like pally relationship. They're not that pally at all. And what's interesting about the Chinese very recently, they've been trying to buy up an engine maker, an aero engine maker in Ukraine that makes these type of jets that which would be compatible with their 5th gen fighter. Because at the moment they've got a 5th gen fighter with an 80s jet. So that tells me at the moment, right, they don't have tic tac type technology, UAP tech, but I'm sure that they would want to. And as the Colonel has said, everything from nanotechnology, they've declared that they've got quantum supremacy in computing. They've got a whole, like the Colonel said, a whole national priority list, and they have got this continuity, and they can just say, right, we want to have this, and they've released a paper, right, we want to have this by, the year 2040. This is where we want to be. And while, American governments will come and go and priorities change, and, the Chinese can have that kind of continuity, assuming that they don't have some kind of, a political upset. So I think that they'll be very, very interested in anything that gives them, a decisive advantage. And I think if they got it, then they would definitely use it.
Well, I think we also would be a huge error to assume that these interactions that have been reported in ATIP only happen to American aircraft. My guess is that these happen to, UFOs are a global phenomena. We know that. We would almost have to assume, just from a security standpoint, that these incidents are occurring there, and they would have equal interest and understand the ramifications of being, that far ahead and are willing to do it. I'd also remind you that something has happened within the last week, is that Russia and China have just agreed to a moon base operation. I've always looked at Russia a little different, or the China-Russia connection. I understand there's some tensions there, but I thought China is using Russia as kind of an R&D component where they would buy the research as opposed to doing it themselves. That's not to say they don't have some very, very advanced research going on in their own areas. There's certain areas. If we look on one of back in the bad old days, we were making assessment of where the Soviets were, and there were certain areas that we acknowledged that the Soviets were ahead. The Russians that I've met are very, very meticulous researchers.
Just a quick point on that. I mean, about the the Chinese espionage, right? If you look at George Knapp shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, he went to Russia and he got hold of the Thread 3 files, which I talked about, which was Soviet and Russian research right into UAP. So he got hold of those. Now another researcher is also claiming to have access to those files. So is it beyond comprehension that the Chinese would also have prioritized getting hold of those files, having considerably more resources than an investigative reporter and a researcher with money to bribe people? Because the Chinese, they will bribe and steal their way into getting anything.
I'm going to mention a bit of an aside, but last part of 2019, we made a trip into Central Asia. And the thing that surprised us there was the infrastructure developments and just how advanced. I thought we were going to a developing country, and found, like in Kazakhstan, areas there where the infrastructure exceeds that in many parts of the US. And what they're doing, China is doing, is they're establishing relationships all there. And most of that is in getting energy, because they have, great requirements there. But they're developing a huge network across there. The other thing I would remind, I think people would be surprised that the countries there, we think of them as being free of the Soviet Union. Many of them would prefer, frankly, to reestablish the Soviet Union. There's a great affinity there that I don't think is certainly recognized here. But I think those relationships are going to be things to watch, and it's advanced beyond. I'll give you an example. In Almaty, there was something called Expo 17. And we went into that, and it was on energy per se. And some of the energy sources that they were looking at were very, very advanced. And, like beyond what I've seen, certainly as an expo here in the US.
Do you believe that a UFO management organization named MJ12 or something close to that, such as Majority 12, Magic, etc., do either of you think that something like this ever existed?
As stated there, no. Did MJ12 exist? I think yes, and it had nothing to do with UFOs.
I could just add to that. I actually looked at one of the sort of purported Majestic 12 documents, which was the Special Operations Manual.
Yeah.
And I just basically found it to be just kind of like full of holes. I can't see how a military officer or anybody with any knowledge of kind of military operations could have written it. I mean, it's 26 pages, and it basically looks like what we Brits would call like it's been written on the back of a fag packet, written on the back of a cigarette packet. It's got just sort of inconsistencies in it that just lead me to believe no, it couldn't have been written by someone. I mean, it's a 26-page document, and you're talking about something really, really complex like crash retrieval, which could be like at sea, in a mountainous area, in a desert area, and that's just maybe assuming that it's accessible from like the United States. What about if it's in hostile contested territory? Too many holes in that particular document for me to think that it's real.
But I will say, and I was told that the list of the personnel is in fact correct. And if you look at what their capabilities were, the specific timing involved, and I'll tell you directly what I think it was related to, and that was something called COG, the continuity of government. How do you present nuclear decapitation? And if you look at that list of people, it is exactly who you would have wanted at that time to create, and it would have been super, super secret. And yes, lots of things there about not written down and that sort of thing. And you look at the timing to the day is literally makes sense.
So would you put it down to a very clever civilian hoax, or maybe disinformation that's been put out into the field?
Well, I think it's people who don't understand, and this is one of the problems with secrecy, is that people, assume that certain things happen. And there's a word I created literally called ergo fusion, which means a misidentification of causal relationships. And you find that frequently in these things. If you can't see into the box, you then start assuming what it was designed for. And again, if you look at it from a perspective of the day, I forget the exact day that it was signed, but it was literally to the day when Truman signed it and who was involved, that, go forth and protect the United. Remember the bad old days where you're too young to remember duck and cover, and, those things were evolving, that the Soviets were going to, launch a surprise nuclear attack and decapitate the country. That was frontline thinking at that time. And to have an organization or a structure that would be in place to prevent that.
Right.
And you have that sort of people who were all, many of them experts in nuclear weapons, and there were very few at the time who were doing that kind of thinking. Makes a lot more sense than UFO crash. I also point out one of the things we haven't discussed here, but gets into the quote disclosure, and I put a lot of credence in what's called the Twining memo. You're probably familiar with that.
Yeah.
But remember, that came out after Roswell, was top secret, talking internally, says, hey, this is very real. These are not illusions. We've got to worry about this sort of thing. And not even an inference to his own people that he's talking to in top secret channel. Oh, I think we have a leg up on this because something happened.
Do you both believe that the government is in control of the UAP portfolio, or has it been primarily sequestered into the confines of private industry as it relates to, spearhead defense contractors, corporate technology giants, etc.?
No.
Just no.
I don't. And I have had this discussion with many people, and I come down and even change my mind from time to time. I don't think it's there. I don't think it's anywhere.
Okay. Frank, anything to add there?
I think I was kind of compelled by the Colonel's arguments reading his book, when I was reading about, all the, and other books as well. I've just been reading a book called Kill Chain, about, consolidation in the defense industry, how it's gone from sort of hundreds of companies to sort of less than sort of 4 or 5 very big players. Very difficult to hide that type of thing, I think. I mean, very difficult with all the different industry changes that you've had, all the due diligence that you have when you acquire a new company, business units being moved around, personnel being moved around. I mean, it'd be very, very difficult to keep that kind of thing secret, I think, with all those kind of company changes going on. What do you think, Colonel?
I call that the begat problem. And, from the biblical standpoint, so begat. And what you're saying is exactly correct. If you start looking at the industrial changes that have taken place and all the due diligence that has to take place when you're moving these things about, if you look at the industries as they existed, little than 50 years ago, even 20 or 30 years ago, how many of what you've called correctly the business elements moving back and forth? It doesn't make sense.
Kind of staying within this vein, Colonel, you've been a close colleague to Eric Davis for many years, and one area of interest of mine has been the Admiral Wilson leaks, also known as the Eric Davis notes. Now, we know that these notes were leaked from the estate of the late Edgar Mitchell. We know that Eric Davis has avoided confirmatory statements regarding the legitimacy of the documents, but he has also provided quite long-winded no comments, citing secrecy laws and the potential for this material to be connected to ongoing programs. Ergo, he refuses to comment further, as well as Dr. Hal Puthoff. He's given similar statements about the possibility of this information pertaining to ongoing programs that are potentially classified, and so he has refused to comment further. But all of this verbal gymnastics from both Hal and Eric would indicate quite strongly that there is more to these leaked documents than some within the UFO field would have us believe. Otherwise, a simple no comment or denial of ownership would be acceptable, but this has not been the case, which leads me to believe these documents may be representative of a real scenario. I just wanted to ask, have you ever been told by Eric or anyone else involved that these leaked documents are from a real meeting that took place with Admiral Thomas R. Wilson?
No, and it doesn't make sense. Yeah, we're going to go meet in a car and I'm sorry, the whole, and of course, I think Wilson has said he wasn't here at the time anyway, but no, the scenario does not make sense to me, and I have no special knowledge of it one way or another. And I haven't discussed it with either Hal or Eric.
Well, can I ask why you think they would make the kind of comments they've made? Because I mean, if it wasn't a real scenario,
I'd have to ask them.
Yeah. Okay. It just seems really strange to
me. Really
me.
don't know.
Okay, no worries. Well, another thing I wanted to gauge both of your opinions on is the upcoming UAP task force report that's set to come out in June. Now, most of us are aware that the report is due to be made public, but will contain a classified annex. There have been some voices in the community that are less than optimistic about the level of information that will be made available to the public via this report. Others believe it will truly change the conversation on UFOs for the public and mainstream body politic. And I'd just like to get your opinion on how impactful you think this will be. Is it going to be a big deal, or should people maybe reduce their expectations a bit?
I would reduce your expectations, frankly. Again, this is not inside the military. This is not a big deal. This is something they're being forced to do reluctantly. And unfortunately, as we've discussed, there are so many areas where you don't know. So frankly, you're releasing a report on embarrassment. But all you can say is these things happen. These are the observations. Maybe release some more of the video. But I think when it gets down to, more than that, again, the phenomena keeps changing. It is global. And remember the point in the Air Force when we went back to the Condon report, the Colorado report, they got exactly what they wanted. They just wanted it to go away. The handling Blue Book and all that was a pain in the ass. And, so just moving, getting the action out, I think they will do the minimal amount necessary. If you look at the prior examples in the two Roswell reports, I think are probably pretty good examples. Be also waiting to see who it goes out. I'm betting it's going to be a lieutenant colonel or lower, or maybe some congressional, maybe a colonel doing it. But again, not. It's not going to be earth-shattering.
I'd agree with that. I'd say, well, first of all, as well, to meet people's expectations, the UAPTF it hasn't been set up to be a clearinghouse, for people interested in UFOs, right? That's not what it does. It's an organ of government, an organ of the DoD. But if you look at all the problems it's got like an incredibly tight time frame, right, to get through 70 years. Yeah. 70 years of data and history. So you've got funding issues or lack of funding, staffing issues. Okay, there's not that many people there, but then you've got the sort of senior staff change. You've got to get around 80 odd intelligence agencies that all kind of guard their prerogatives jealously. They guard their platforms, they guard their capabilities, they guard their sources, they guard their secrets. And to sort of put it in perspective, Richard Dolan, right, in his book, UFOs, the National Security State, he's on his third volume now of that, right? How many years has it taken him to write that, to cover 70 years of history? And one bloke is supposed to, one bloke or three blokes are supposed to do it in 180 days or whatever.
That's a good point.
But I think you should look at UFOs case closed, where you did have, Colonel Wilson, or the colonel who came out and gave the report. The reality is it came from an Air Force captain I mean, we're talking third tier of 10 tiers. This is a relatively low-level position, and it tells you the level of importance. It's going to be interesting to see who actually involved. Now that you got congressional interest may up it a bit, but I haven't heard from anybody. I'm just willing to bet that they see this as an inconvenience more than anything else.
Colonel, you've said before that one of your primary objectives is to make it permissible for chief scientists and academics to get involved in, the study of various phenomena. Do you feel that headway is being made in that department? There is undoubtedly a high level of stigma still attached to areas such as UFO and other associated studies, but are you optimistic at all about the journey ahead of us when it comes to addressing and understanding these issues in the wider academic arena?
I'll give that a mixed review. There are certain areas, again, if I get into like near-death studies, which is, I think, fundamental, because we're talking there, in UFOs and physics, we're talking of interest to a small number of people. If you talk continuation of consciousness, you ought to be of interest to 100% of the population. And just because on sheer volume and reports that have come out, you're seeing more studies there. The UFO, as we mentioned before, one of the things that's happened is you have some elevated interest, but you have advanced sensor systems, so you're collecting more data. So I think that's better. But I don't see is going to be a serious collective effort. But I am hopeful that, and I get calls and emails all the time for people who are in various area studies, and how can I get a job doing that? And one of the key slides that I use on all UFO studies said, "You have three things you better have. One, you better have thick skin because you're going to be attacked. Two, you better understand conspiracy theories because you're now part of it one way, even if you believe or you don't, you're in a cover up. And third is you better have a day job or be independently wealthy because nobody's making a lot of money at this."
Anything to add there, Frank?
No, I just I would say I'm glad to see that from sort of like physicists to astrophysicists that people, more scientists are talking about it and actually writing papers on it. UAP, and you see this more and more. Michael Masters, who we talked about earlier, was a great example. I don't classify myself as an academic, but in my small way, by getting a sort of globally ranked think tank in the sphere of strategic studies, war studies, geopolitics, national security studies, trying to getting papers published in that sphere is like a small kind of a small drop there, or drops. So I'm more hopeful going forward, and I'm more hopeful because just friends before who 2 years ago would kind of like look at me funny when I talked about it, and I was either disinterested or basically wanted to take the piss out of me. Now they're actually kind of sort of quite interested in it. A lot of my friends who I realized who I didn't know had any interest in it at all are now like, "Oh wow, I really want to watch your next podcast," or "Have you got another paper coming out?" So things are changing.
I agree. I agree entirely. And obviously, it's no small feat getting what you've been able to get into the BESA Center, and it's a quite amazing thing, to be honest, and it is reflective of the change in the conversation. And like you said about friends, I too, with friends and family who, to be honest, when it was I think 2017 and I was putting Facebook updates on about ATIP and Lou Elizondo, people were like, "What are you talking about? This is crazy stuff." But now, fast forward into present day, the same people are messaging me saying, "Hey, this is really interesting. I want to know more." So I think you're right about a level of engagement increasing here. We've been going for quite a while, gentlemen, and that's just about concluded all the questions I have. Is there anything that you guys wanted to wrap up with before we close this off?
I'm good.
No, I just want to say, thanks to you both, Jay. It's been really good being on, and it was always, Colonel. It's always great, conversing and getting the benefit of your experience.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure to be here with both of you, in all honesty, and to go over these topics. Colonel Alexander, I want to thank you as well for taking so much time to do this with Frank and myself. And just once again, Frank, I want to thank you for putting together these fantastic papers.
Thank you very much, both of you.